By 1941, Adolf Hitler had become the living embodiment of Germany's restored pride, a figure whose image was meticulously curated to project power, unity, and inevitability. To the German public, he was not just a political leader, he was the savior of the nation, a man who had promised to undo the humiliations of the Treaty of Versailles, rebuild the economy, and reclaim Germany's place as a world power. On the streets of Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich, crowds gathered to cheer his speeches, waving flags adorned with swastikas, chanting slogans, and participating in orchestrated displays of loyalty. Nazi propaganda ensured that every citizen saw Hitler as infallible, every policy as visionary, and every military maneuver as a step toward inevitable victory. Yet beneath this carefully constructed image, reality was far more complex. The Nazi state, while outwardly monolithic, was riddled with tensions, rivalries, and uncertainties. Hitler's inner circle was a collection of strong personalities: Goering, Himmler, Goebbels, and others, each ambitious, jealous, and often in direct competition with one another. Decisions were frequently made not through institutional deliberation, but through Hitler's personal authority, leaving the Reich vulnerable to miscalculations and factionalism. This concentration of power made the leadership appear disciplined and unified to outsiders, but internally, the regime's cohesion was far more fragile. The German military successes of 1939 and 1940 reinforced the myth of invincibility. The rapid defeat of Poland in September 1939, followed by the stunning campaign in the West, France, Belgium, and the Low Countries falling in a matter of weeks, cemented Hitler's reputation as a military genius. These early victories were used relentlessly in propaganda to foster the impression that Germany's triumphs were the product of flawless planning, superior strategy, and a disciplined citizenry united behind its leader. State-controlled newspapers, newsreels, and radio broadcasts presented Germany as a nation blessed with an unstoppable Führer, a disciplined army that could crush any opponent. At the same time, Hitler's personal charisma and ideological narrative were central to sustaining this perception. He framed his military campaigns as both patriotic duty and historical destiny, portraying Germany's enemies as morally corrupt and weak. His speeches emphasized renewal, destiny, and the inevitability of victory. For many Germans, the Führer's words were not mere rhetoric, they were an assurance of order in a world still reeling from the chaos of World War I and the economic devastation of the 1920s. The promise of a restored, invincible Germany became a deeply emotional and psychological anchor for the population, binding them to the regime even as the realities of war grew increasingly complex. Yet, even in this period of apparent triumph, the first subtle signs of instability began to emerge. Hitler's overconfidence, cultivated by unbroken victories, began influencing strategic decisions. While he was celebrated for his intuition and decisiveness, the concentration of power in his hands meant that the Reich's military strategy increasingly relied on a single man's judgment. This centralized decision-making created vulnerabilities, particularly when reality clashed with ideology. Hitler's military advisors often hesitated to contradict him, fearing reprisal or marginalization, which led to a dangerous feedback loop. Only those opinions that reinforced Hitler's perspective were heard, while dissenting voices were suppressed or ignored. The contrast between public perception and internal reality was also reflected in the bureaucracy and the Nazi Party itself. While propaganda portrayed a seamless, disciplined leadership, factions within the party jostled for influence. Heinrich Himmler's SS increasingly operated with near autonomy, while Göring and the Luftwaffe jockeyed for prominence. These overlapping responsibilities often created confusion and inefficiency. To the public, Hitler appeared omnipotent. To those inside the regime, the façade masked the growing instability of a system where loyalty to the Führer was paramount, but personal ambition and ideological differences constantly threatened cohesion. The international context also amplified the illusion of invincibility. As Germany expanded its control across Europe, Allied powers struggled to counter the rapid succession of German victories. France, the United Kingdom, and other nations faced not only military defeats, but also the psychological impact of Germany's seemingly unstoppable advance. Hitler and his propagandists exploited these perceptions abroad, crafting the image of a leader who could achieve what others deemed impossible. The message was clear: Germany had recovered, the Reich was strong, and resistance was futile. Yet, for all its outward strength, cracks were beginning to appear. Economic strains, logistical challenges, and the immense human costs of war were not always visible to the public, but were increasingly felt by the military and administrative apparatus. Hitler's reliance on ideological principles over pragmatic military strategy created tension between long-term ambitions and short-term necessities. As he prepared to launch new campaigns, these tensions would become ever more pronounced, exposing the fragility of the regime's foundations. The first public hints of internal instability, although carefully masked, came from unexpected quarters. Key members of Hitler's inner circle began making decisions that suggested divergence from the Führer's immediate intentions. Rivalry simmered behind closed doors, with individuals maneuvering to assert influence over the direction of policy and military planning. The façade of unity remained intact in public appearances, but observers within Germany and eventually abroad would begin to notice subtle inconsistencies in messaging and execution. Propaganda remained the glue holding this fragile image together. Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Propaganda, understood the power of perception better than most. His machinery was sophisticated, orchestrating a constant stream of content designed to distract, inspire, and manipulate. Reports of military setbacks, internal disagreements, or policy failures were suppressed or reframed. Successes were amplified, often exaggerated, to reinforce the narrative of an invincible Führer. Goebbels' genius lay not only in celebrating victories, but in creating a psychological barrier between the public and the harsh realities that the regime faced. For many Germans, this constructed reality was indistinguishable from truth. Yet, even in this environment of tightly controlled perception, instability could not be entirely hidden. Hitler's growing overconfidence, coupled with the pressures of extended campaigns, laid the groundwork for critical mistakes. The very traits that had propelled him to power: charisma, decisiveness, and ideological zeal now began creating vulnerabilities. The illusion of invincibility, carefully cultivated over years, was increasingly at odds with the operational realities of war. It was a tension that would define the trajectory of Germany's military and political decisions in the months to come. By the spring of 1941, Germany's outward image of dominance was at its zenith. Hitler's personal mythology had become a self-reinforcing force, with public adulation feeding his strategic boldness, and propaganda ensuring that every victory, however small, was magnified into evidence of infallibility. Yet beneath this carefully crafted surface, the regime's internal contradictions and the human frailties of its leadership foreshadowed the coming crises. The first cracks in the Nazi edifice, though invisible to most, were beginning to widen, setting the stage for events that would challenge the very notion of Hitler's invincibility. The illusion of invincibility was a carefully maintained mirage, an intricate tapestry of image, ideology, and fear. Hitler's early successes had made this mirage compelling, yet the foundations were far from solid. Internal rivalries, logistical challenges, and the inherent risks of centralized decision-making ensured that the regime's triumphs could not endure unchallenged. The stage was set for a dramatic collision between perception and reality, a collision that would soon manifest in the unexpected and audacious actions of Hitler's own deputies, revealing the fragile core beneath the Nazi facade. By May 1941, the façade of unity that Adolf Hitler and his propaganda machine had carefully cultivated faced a dramatic and unexpected test. While the German public continued to perceive the Führer as omnipotent, and military campaigns seemed to proceed without flaw, a startling event shook the Nazi hierarchy. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's longtime deputy and one of the most loyal figures in the inner circle, embarked on a solo mission that would expose the cracks in the Nazi edifice. On the night of May 10th, Hess took off from Augsburg in a Messerschmitt Bf 110, leaving the comfort of the Nazi command structure, and flew deep into enemy territory, eventually parachuting into Scotland. His self-declared mission, ostensibly a peace overture to Britain, stunned both Germany and the Allies alike. Hess's flight was audacious in the extreme, defying logic, protocol, and the rigid discipline that characterized Hitler's leadership style. As deputy Führer, Hess had wielded considerable influence in party affairs, helping to consolidate Hitler's control in the years following the Nazis' rise to power. He was seen as a loyal confidant, a steadfast supporter whose ideological commitment matched the Führer's own. Yet, his decision to act independently demonstrated both personal ambition and the existence of fissures within the leadership that had long been hidden from public view. While the German people believed their leaders operated in a disciplined, united front, Hess's actions revealed that ambition, misjudgment, and personal initiative could disrupt even the most tightly controlled regime. The motivations behind Hess's mission were complex. Ostensibly, he claimed that he was seeking to negotiate a peace settlement with Britain. However, closer examination suggests a deeper, more personal agenda. Hess had grown increasingly concerned about his own marginalization within the Nazi hierarchy. By 1941, his influence had waned, particularly as figures like Himmler and Göring rose in prominence, and Hitler increasingly relied on direct military and political control. In Hess's mind, a bold diplomatic initiative could restore his stature, placing him back at the center of power while simultaneously securing what he believed would be a favorable outcome for Germany. Whether he truly believed he could negotiate with Britain or whether his plan was rooted in delusion is a matter historians continue to debate. What is undeniable is that his flight exposed vulnerabilities in the Nazi leadership structure that had previously been invisible. Hess's arrival in Scotland immediately created a crisis for both the Allies and the Nazi regime. The British, initially baffled by the unexpected visitor, quickly recognized the propaganda potential of the incident. He was neither a soldier nor an official diplomat, but a high-ranking political figure attempting a solo negotiation in the midst of a global war. British intelligence interrogations revealed the peculiarity of the mission. Hess presented himself as a peace envoy motivated by concern for Germany's future, yet his plans lacked official sanction or coordination with Hitler. For London, the incident was an intelligence windfall, providing insight into the internal dynamics and rivalries of the Nazi leadership. Hess's mission was not only unauthorized, but also dangerously revealing, highlighting that even the inner circle of the Third Reich was susceptible to unilateral, unpredictable action. Within Germany, Hess's disappearance was initially a source of panic. Hitler, upon learning of the betrayal, reacted with fury and disbelief. The notion that a trusted deputy had undertaken such a reckless venture, potentially undermining the Reich's position in the war, was intolerable. Hitler's personal reaction was compounded by the public relations nightmare that threatened to unravel the carefully curated image of a unified, invincible leadership. If Germans learned that the Führer's own deputy had acted independently, it could undermine confidence in the regime and sow doubt about the supposed cohesion at the highest levels of power. The Nazi propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, acted swiftly to contain the damage. Goebbels' solution was both cunning and brutal. Hess had to be portrayed as a madman, a deluded individual whose actions did not reflect the will or unity of the Nazi Party. Newspapers across Germany published carefully crafted narratives framing Hess's flight as irrational, emphasizing his mental instability while reiterating the unbroken loyalty and strength of Hitler's leadership. Newsreels and radio broadcasts reinforced the message. The Führer remained unchallenged, and the Reich's direction was steady and unshakable. For the average German, the public presentation of Hess's actions served its purpose. The regime appeared unbroken, and the myth of unity endured. Yet beneath the veneer of propaganda, the incident revealed the fragility of the Nazi hierarchy. Hess's ability to act independently, without immediate intervention or detection, highlighted the limitations of Hitler's control over his deputies. It exposed the personal ambitions and rivalries simmering within the inner circle, showing that loyalty could be compromised by personal calculation, ideological zeal, or sheer audacity. The episode also underscored the dangers inherent in a system that centralized power as single figure. When decision-making bypassed institutional checks, the consequences of individual initiative could be dramatic and destabilizing. Historians have also noted the psychological implications of the Hess incident for Hitler himself. The flight was a stark reminder that even his closest allies were capable of action beyond his control. It tested his ability to manage both internal dissent and public perception simultaneously. In response, Hitler tightened his control over the inner circle, increasing surveillance and emphasizing loyalty as the ultimate measure of a deputy's worth. The incident marked a turning point in his relationships with senior figures, reinforcing the Führer's reliance on fear, ideological alignment, and personal loyalty over institutional structures. It also heightened Hitler's sense of invulnerability, paradoxically by spinning the event as an anomaly caused by Hess's instability. Hitler reinforced his own narrative of perfection and inevitability while ensuring that similar challenges to his authority would be suppressed in the future. For the British, Hess's flight was an opportunity as well as a puzzle. They had in their hands a high-ranking figure whose knowledge of the inner workings of the Nazi regime could be leveraged for intelligence purposes. Interrogations at the time revealed Hess's obsession with a negotiated peace, but also his detachment from the practicalities of statecraft. He was idealistic, overconfident in his ability to influence British policymakers, and blind to the realities of Hitler's absolute control. His naivete was matched only by the audacity of the flight itself, which involved crossing heavily defended airspace in a single-engine plane, risking interception, and ultimately parachuting into enemy territory without any support. It was an act of desperation, courage, or folly, likely all three simultaneously. The incident also had broader symbolic resonance. Hess represented the fragile bridge between Nazi ideology and personal ambition, illustrating how individuals within the regime could simultaneously embody loyalty and self-interest. While the German public continued to see the Nazis as a monolithic force, the reality was far more precarious. Leadership was a delicate balance of fear, ideology, propaganda, and personal ambition, and Hess's actions brought these dynamics into sharp relief. The myth of an unassailable Führer, carefully nurtured by Goebbels, had survived, but only through careful manipulation and suppression of inconvenient truths. The Hess episode also reverberated through the broader strategic planning of the war. Hitler's immediate response, ordering tighter control and emphasizing the loyalty of deputies, was aimed at preserving both internal cohesion and external perception. Yet the incident illustrated a fundamental weakness in the Nazi state: reliance on a small cadre of individuals whose personal decisions could have outsized consequences. The centralized nature of decision-making meant that the failure or misjudgment of a single figure could disrupt broader strategic aims. Hess's solo flight was more than a personal quixotic adventure. It was a warning signal that the veneer of unity and control was far more fragile than the world perceived. Furthermore, the Hess incident highlighted the interplay between ideology and reality. Hess, motivated by a combination of ideological conviction and personal ambition, had misjudged both Britain's willingness to negotiate and his own capacity to influence events. His actions were framed within the ideological narrative of peace and reconciliation, but they collided with the geopolitical realities of a world at war. The result was not only personal failure, but a momentary destabilization of the carefully maintained illusion of Nazi cohesion. In conclusion, Rudolf Hess's flight to Britain in May 1941 was a dramatic expose of the vulnerabilities inherent in Hitler's regime. While outward appearances continued to project unity, strength, and invincibility, the incident revealed a far more complex reality: a leadership divided by ambition, prone to miscalculation, and heavily reliant on propaganda to maintain public perception. Hess's audacity, naivety, and ambition exposed the cracks beneath the Nazi façade, forcing Hitler and Goebbels to manage both internal dissent and public perception with precision. The episode foreshadowed the risks associated with overambitious campaigns and ideological zeal, risks that would soon manifest in Germany's eastern expansion and set the stage for the Reich's first major strategic misstep. The Hess incident was a lesson in the dangers of overconfidence, the fragility of centralized authority, and the power of perception in totalitarian regimes. It underscored a central paradox of Nazi Germany. The outward image of perfection and unity was often maintained through careful manipulation and fear, yet beneath that image lay a turbulent mix of ambition, rivalry, and overreach. For historians, the episode serves as a vivid illustration of how even the most tightly controlled regimes are vulnerable to the unpredictability of human behavior, ambition, and ideological extremism. While Rudolf Hess's audacious flight exposed the fragile dynamics of Hitler's inner circle, the Führer himself was preparing for an even more ambitious and perilous undertaking: the invasion of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, was not merely a military campaign, it was the embodiment of Hitler's ideological vision. A crusade that fused the quest for Lebensraum, the eradication of Bolshevism, and the ultimate expansion of the Third Reich into the heart of Eastern Europe. To Hitler and his closest advisors, this campaign represented both destiny and necessity, a confrontation that would define the Reich's future. The conception of Barbarossa had deep roots in Nazi ideology. Hitler's worldview, articulated in Mein Kampf and reiterated in countless speeches, depicted the Soviet Union as the epicenter of racial, ideological, and political evil. Bolshevism, communism, and Jewish influence were conflated in Hitler's mind as existential threats to the German people and the European order he envisioned. Conquering the East was therefore framed not as an optional military maneuver, but as a moral imperative, a decisive strike that would secure Germany's dominance, eradicate perceived enemies, and provide living space for generations of Germans. The ideological weight of Barbarossa elevated it beyond a conventional war plan. It became a defining statement of Nazi purpose. From a military perspective, the operation was unprecedented in scale. The Wehrmacht mobilized nearly 3 million troops, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft, stretching across a front thousands of miles long. The plan called for 3 primary army groups: North, Center, and South, each tasked with distinct objectives. Army Group North aimed to capture Leningrad, Army Group Center targeted Moscow, and Army Group South sought control of Ukraine's fertile plains. The strategy relied on speed, surprise, and overwhelming force, the classic principles of blitzkrieg that had brought early successes in Poland, France, and the Low Countries. Yet the vast distances, logistical challenges, and the resilience of the Soviet forces created risks that would soon test the limits of German planning. The initial phase of Barbarossa was a demonstration of operational brilliance tempered by human suffering. German forces advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, encircling and capturing vast numbers of Red Army soldiers. Battles were fought with staggering intensity. Artillery, armored divisions, and air power combined to create a sense of inevitability. Nazi propaganda framed these early victories as evidence of Hitler's infallibility and the superiority of German arms. Newsreels showed triumphant soldiers, burning villages, and captured territory, reinforcing the myth that the Reich could achieve its ideological goals with speed and precision. Yet beneath the apparent success lay the seeds of overreach. The Wehrmacht's logistical network struggled to supply an army advancing across hundreds of miles of rugged terrain, compounded by inadequate infrastructure, poor roads, and extended supply lines. Fuel, ammunition, and food became constant challenges, and the harsh Russian terrain increasingly tested the limits of German mobility. The Red Army, while initially caught off guard, demonstrated resilience and adaptability, regrouping, conducting counterattacks, and leveraging the immense geographical scale to their advantage. What appeared as a rapid, unstoppable advance began to reveal vulnerabilities, highlighting the gap between Hitler's ideological ambitions and the practical realities of war. The human dimension of the campaign also reflected the brutality inherent in Nazi strategy. Barbarossa was not merely a conflict between armies. It was framed as a racial and ideological war. The treatment of civilians, partisans, and captured soldiers often reflected the genocidal policies embedded in Nazi ideology. Einsatzgruppen units followed the advancing army, executing Jews, political commissars, and perceived enemies of the Reich. Villages were destroyed, communities terrorized, and atrocities became systemic. The military success of Barbarossa was inseparable from the ideological ruthlessness that defined the campaign, a stark illustration of how Hitler's worldview directly shaped operational conduct. Hitler's strategic calculus during Barbarossa was also informed by a combination of confidence and hubris. He believed that the Soviet Union would collapse under the weight of the German onslaught. Failing to anticipate the Red Army's capacity for mobilization, the industrial resilience of the Soviet interior, or the logistical challenges posed by the vast expanses of territory. His ideological convictions viewing Slavs as inferior and communism as inherently decadent underpinned assumptions that would prove catastrophically optimistic. While initial successes reinforced the Führer's belief in his own genius, the complexity of sustaining an extended campaign across hostile terrain foreshadowed the difficulties that would later plague the Reich. The operational plan for Barbarossa was meticulously detailed on paper, but underestimated real-world conditions. Coordination among the three army groups was essential yet fraught with challenges. Communication lines were stretched thin, weather and terrain created delays, and command decisions were often left to local commanders, who sometimes acted without full strategic oversight. These difficulties, coupled with Hitler's increasing interference in tactical matters, created friction between military pragmatism and ideological ambition. Commanders were forced to balance operational effectiveness with the political and racial objectives imposed from above, a tension that would intensify as the campaign progressed. As German forces pressed eastward, the initial psychological impact on the Soviet Union was profound. Entire cities and regions fell under German control in weeks, and the scale of the invasion overwhelmed local authorities. Yet Stalin's regime, though initially paralyzed by surprise, began implementing defensive strategies, mobilizing reserves, and relocating industrial capacity to the interior. The Soviet people, faced with existential threat, exhibited extraordinary resilience, undermining the assumption that ideology alone would dictate the outcome of the campaign. What had been conceived as a rapid, decisive blow gradually became a grinding confrontation, testing the endurance, discipline, and logistical capacity of the Wehrmacht. Hitler's personal involvement in operational decision-making further complicated the campaign. He frequently overruled generals, insisted on ideological objectives taking precedence over tactical necessity, and underestimated the impact of weather and terrain. These decisions reflected a broader pattern in which ideological zeal and overconfidence shaped military strategy, sometimes at the expense of pragmatic considerations. The tension between ideology and reality became a defining feature of the campaign, illustrating the limits of centralized, personality-driven decision-making in complex military operations. By mid-1941, Barbarossa had achieved remarkable territorial gains, capturing millions of Soviet soldiers and vast tracts of land. Yet the German army was increasingly overextended. Supply lines strained to breaking point, partisan activity in the rear disrupted communications, and the harshness of the Russian environment, forests, rivers, and swamps slowed the advance. Hitler's ideological framing of the campaign, emphasizing conquest and racial subjugation, further diverted attention from the practical demands of sustaining an army in hostile territory. The gap between expectation and reality widened, sowing the seeds for strategic complications that would later become disastrous. Propaganda continued to play a crucial role in maintaining the facade of success. Within Germany, newspapers, newsreels, and radio broadcasts emphasized the speed of the advance, the destruction of communist forces, and the inevitability of German triumph. Soldiers returning on leave were portrayed as heroes, their experiences framed as part of a historic mission to liberate Europe from Bolshevism. The ideological overlay of Barbarossa helped reconcile public perception with the mounting challenges faced by the Wehrmacht, creating a narrative in which the Führer's strategic brilliance remained unquestioned, even as practical difficulties mounted on the front lines. Yet the cracks in the campaign were becoming increasingly evident to military observers. Senior officers noted the dangers of overextension, the vulnerability of supply lines, and the risk posed by harsh winter conditions. Reports warned that the Red Army, despite initial losses, could regroup, fortify, and exploit Germany's logistical weaknesses. Hitler, confident in his own judgment and convinced of ideological inevitability, largely dismissed these concerns. His overconfidence, reinforced by prior successes and the myth of personal infallibility, contributed to decisions that would ultimately compromise the campaign's long-term prospects. Operation Barbarossa thus represents a crucial turning point in the history of the Third Reich. It exemplifies the collision of ideological ambition and military reality, demonstrating how Hitler's worldview shaped strategic decisions in ways that both achieved spectacular short-term success and sowed the seeds of future failure. The campaign highlighted the limitations of centralized authority, the dangers of overconfidence, and the profound human cost of ideological warfare. It also underscored the vulnerability of the Nazi regime to factors beyond its control: distance, terrain, weather, and the resilience of an enemy capable of strategic adaptation. In historical retrospect, Barbarossa illustrates the consequences of strategic overreach. Hitler's ambitions extended beyond what the Wehrmacht could realistically sustain, driven as much by ideology and the desire for historical legacy as by pragmatic military calculation. The initial victories, while impressive, masked structural vulnerabilities that would soon manifest in the form of logistical collapse, harsh environmental conditions, and a revitalized Soviet defense. The campaign also deepened the internal pressures within the Nazi leadership, as military setbacks and logistical difficulties challenged the authority and assumptions of the Führer, foreshadowing conflicts that would further strain an already fragile hierarchy. Finally, Barbarossa reveals the profound interplay between ideology, leadership, and operational reality. Hitler's personal vision of conquest, combined with the centralized decision-making structure of the Nazi state, created a situation in which short-term triumphs could easily obscure long-term vulnerabilities. The campaign was a dramatic illustration of both the power and the peril of personality-driven leadership, where the charisma and conviction of one man could achieve extraordinary results but also generate catastrophic risks. The ideological imperatives that guided Barbarossa, the elimination of Bolshevism, the conquest of eastern territories, and the pursuit of Lebensraum, were inseparable from the military and logistical realities that would ultimately challenge their feasibility. By the late summer of 1941, Germany had achieved remarkable gains, but at the cost of overextension, rising casualties, and the beginnings of logistical strain. The ambitious Eastern Campaign revealed the tension between Hitler's ideological objectives and the practical demands of modern warfare, tension that would define the trajectory of the Third Reich's military fortunes. While propaganda continued to present an image of invincibility, the realities on the Eastern Front foreshadowed the vulnerabilities that would shape the coming months. The collision of ideology and operational reality set the stage for one of the most consequential strategic miscalculations of the entire war, marking a turning point that would reverberate through the remainder of the conflict. As German forces surged deep into the Soviet Union during Operation Barbarossa, the image of Adolf Hitler as an infallible leader remained meticulously maintained by Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine. The Reich's propaganda apparatus worked tirelessly to create a seamless narrative, rapid victories, heroic soldiers, and a Führer whose genius guided every move. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and newsreels presented images of triumphant German troops, captured Soviet prisoners, and supposedly crumbling Bolshevik resistance. From the perspective of the German public, the Eastern Campaign was an unstoppable march toward destiny, a validation of Hitler's ideological vision and strategic acumen. Yet behind this facade, the reality of the campaign was increasingly complex and perilous. German forces, initially advancing with breathtaking speed, now faced the immense logistical and environmental challenges of a vast, hostile land. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles, roads deteriorated under heavy traffic, and the sheer scale of the Soviet territory began to strain the Wehrmacht's operational capabilities. Fuel, ammunition, and food shortages became increasingly acute, particularly for armored divisions that relied on mobility to maintain their tactical advantage. The discipline, training, and morale that had carried German troops through earlier campaigns were tested in unprecedented ways, revealing vulnerabilities hidden beneath the veneer of rapid success. The gap between public perception and operational reality created profound challenges for the Nazi leadership. Hitler's ideological imperatives, conquest, destruction of communism, and racial subjugation often conflicted with the pragmatic necessities of warfare. Troop movements were frequently dictated by symbolic or ideological objectives rather than tactical logic. Cities were targeted for ideological significance, partisan activity was ruthlessly suppressed, and captured territories were expected to produce resources in line with Nazi ambitions, sometimes at the expense of military efficiency. This intersection of ideology and military pragmatism created systemic inefficiencies that, over time, would erode the effectiveness of the Wehrmacht. Internally, cracks in the leadership continued to manifest. The Hess incident, which had occurred just weeks prior, remained a stark reminder of the fragility of the Nazi hierarchy. While Goebbels had successfully spun Hess as a madman, the inner circle could not ignore the lesson. Even loyal deputies could act unpredictably, and the facade of unity required constant vigilance. Hitler's response was a combination of personal authority and micromanagement. He increasingly involved himself in operational decisions, often overruling generals and emphasizing ideological objectives over strategic pragmatism. While this maintained the appearance of control, it also introduced friction within the command structure as professional military officers grappled with directives shaped more by ideology than battlefield reality. The propaganda apparatus itself became a critical tool for masking the growing difficulties on the front. Goebbels understood that perception could be as powerful as reality. By carefully curating images of success and suppressing reports of setbacks, he maintained public confidence in Hitler's leadership. Stories of heroic offensives were amplified, while logistical challenges, harsh weather, and Soviet resilience were minimized or framed as temporary obstacles. German citizens, consuming discontent daily, remained largely unaware of the systemic strains facing their armies. Propaganda had become both a psychological weapon and a shield, insulating the regime from the destabilizing effects of operational difficulties. Despite these efforts, the realities of the Eastern Front could not be concealed entirely. German officers reported mounting fatigue among troops, rising casualties, and the difficulties of winter warfare in the vast expanses of Russia. Partisan resistance in the rear increasingly disrupted supply lines, while the Red Army adapted, fortifying positions and mounting counterattacks that slowed the German advance. The sheer scale of the territory, combined with environmental and logistical constraints, created conditions in which initial successes could no longer be sustained indefinitely. The gap between ideological expectation and practical capability widened, highlighting the limits of propaganda in masking operational reality. Hitler's personal overconfidence compounded these challenges. Believing that initial victories validated his strategic vision, he continued to push for ambitious objectives, often disregarding the advice of seasoned military commanders. The decision to advance on Moscow, despite warnings about overstretched supply lines and the onset of winter, exemplified the collision between ideological ambition and practical warfare. While soldiers fought bravely and achieved tactical successes, the broader strategic picture revealed vulnerabilities that would later become catastrophic. The Führer's early triumphs, bolstered by propaganda, now risked turning into strategic overreach. The interplay between propaganda and reality also had profound implications for morale and perception on both the home front and the battlefield. Civilians, shielded from the harshest realities, remained convinced of the Reich's invincibility, bolstering domestic support for the war effort. Soldiers, however, increasingly encountered conditions that contradicted official narratives: shortages of supplies, harsh terrain, and the relentless determination of Soviet forces. The dissonance between expectation and experience created subtle tensions within the army as ideological framing clashed with the practical hardships of combat. The Nazi leadership relied on a combination of discipline, fear, and propaganda to bridge this gap, but the strain on the system was growing. The Hess incident's symbolic resonance persisted alongside these operational challenges. It had revealed the fragility of loyalty within the inner circle and the dangers of uncoordinated action. In the context of Barbarossa, the lesson was amplified: centralized, personality-driven decision-making could generate rapid, spectacular successes, but it also exposed the regime to vulnerabilities when individual actions deviated from the plan or when operational realities challenged ideological assumptions. The combination of leadership fragility, overconfidence, and logistical strain created conditions in which the veneer of invincibility could be punctured by unexpected setbacks. By late 1941, the cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. The Wehrmacht had advanced deep into Soviet territory, but at a cost that increasingly strained resources and morale. Winter loomed on the horizon, and the Red Army had begun to regroup, demonstrating resilience that contradicted the Führer's assumptions about rapid collapse. Supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain, and German forces faced both physical and logistical exhaustion. The ideological framing of the campaign, once sufficient to justify rapid advance, now struggled to reconcile with the emerging reality of prolonged, attritional warfare. Propaganda remained critical in managing perception during this period. Goebbels intensified efforts to maintain the narrative of triumph, framing delays and challenges as temporary setbacks easily overcome by the brilliance of German leadership. Soldiers' achievements were highlighted, heroic narratives amplified, and any indication of systemic difficulty suppressed. The tension between what was presented to the public and the operational realities on the front exemplified the Nazi regime's reliance on illusion as a mechanism of control. The façade of unity, strength, and inevitability persisted, but it was increasingly at odds with the underlying vulnerabilities of the Reich. Strategically, the implications were profound. Hitler's ideological zeal had propelled Germany to extraordinary early victories, yet it had also blinded the leadership to the practical limits of extended campaigns. The operational strain of Barbarossa, coupled with the earlier lessons of internal fragility exposed by Hess, demonstrated that the Reich's successes were as much a product of perception, propaganda, and audacity as of sustainable military planning. The illusion of invincibility, while carefully maintained, was now being tested against the harsh realities of geography, logistics, and determined resistance. The beginning of the fall was thus not a single catastrophic event, but a convergence of multiple pressures: overextended military forces, environmental challenges, resilient opposition, internal leadership fragilities, and the limits of propaganda to mask operational stress indefinitely. The regime's early triumphs, celebrated in newsreels and speeches, masked vulnerabilities that would soon be exploited by the Allies and the Soviet Union. Hitler's ideological and strategic ambitions, while initially successful, had created conditions in which overreach, fatigue, and miscalculation could yield disastrous consequences. In sum, the period following the launch of Operation Barbarossa represents a critical inflection point in the history of Nazi Germany. The campaign highlighted the collision between image and reality, ideology and pragmatism, and ambition and capacity. While propaganda maintained the narrative of unassailable strength, the cracks in the system were widening. The Hess incident had foreshadowed the risks of internal instability, and the Eastern Campaign exposed the limits of operational planning under ideological constraints. Together, these factors mark the beginning of the Reich's strategic vulnerabilities, illustrating that even the most meticulously constructed illusion of invincibility could not endure indefinitely. By the end of 1941, Germany's outward image of strength remained compelling, yet beneath the surface, the foundations of the Reich were increasingly unstable. Hitler's overconfidence, combined with the logistical and environmental challenges of the Eastern Front, presaged a confrontation with reality that the regime was ill-prepared to manage. The gap between perception and reality had widened, and the seeds of eventual failure were firmly planted. In this delicate balance of ideology, ambition, and practical limits, the myth of Hitler's invincibility began to crack, setting the stage for the series of strategic and operational setbacks that would define the trajectory of World War II. In this critical phase, historians recognize the intersection of multiple dynamics, the power of propaganda to maintain belief in infallibility, the operational consequences of overambitious planning, and the fragility of a leadership reliant on loyalty and fear. The illusion of unity had been tested, and the initial victories that had reinforced Hitler's reputation now masked profound vulnerabilities. The Führer's ideological zeal, previously a source of extraordinary momentum, had become both a strategic tool and a source of potential disaster. The beginning of the fall had begun not with a dramatic defeat, but with the convergence of internal cracks, overreach, and the inexorable realities of extended warfare.